Thank you very much. Welcome again in this room. It's an honor for me to be there to chair this session dedicated to concluding remarks. So indeed, we'll start by giving the floor to two friends and colleagues representing their respective institutions, Henrik Nielsen and Tanja Fajon. Henrik, we know that the taking over of the new commission will most probably be somewhat delayed. Nevertheless, it is very obvious, just listening to the reports that we've heard, that the challenges are huge and that the Commission, as usual, will be looked at as the engine between the new developments. There are already some indication in the mission letter that was addressed to Commissioner Shinas and Commissioner Johansson. I mean, there was also some indication at the occasion of their hearing and their written comments. You can find also indication in elect President van der Leyen's guidelines for the new Commission, as well as in the strategic guidelines adopted in the strategic agenda, adopted by the European Council in June. We are not going, of course, to ask you to go beyond what the Commission official can say, but we certainly would like to have some of the more documented views about what could come next from the College. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's certainly a pleasure and an honor for me to be here to speak on behalf of the Commission, on behalf of my Director General. I think the time has also come when it's necessary to give a warm thanks to the organizers of this very impressive event. I would say both intellectually with this range of illustrious speakers and a rich program, but also logistically with a flawless organization. That doesn't happen just by itself, so my appreciation not just for the people on the scene, but all the people behind the scenes that have actually made this happen, which is very impressive. I've also been happy from my side to see so many colleagues from the Commission who have been able to come here and take part in the different panels, which I hope has allowed us to absorb as much as we can the different ideas, the different views, and the different discussions that we have had during these 2 days. Now, of course, it's a challenge to give a speech in a closing session in such a rich and dense conference, because what on earth could there be left to say after all these illustrious speakers having covered basically all the topics of the whole migration debate? That would be, let's say, the difficult way to do it, try to improve on that. But there is, of course, also the easy way to do it, and that's to pick up on some of the very clever things said by others and try to build on that. So I'll go for the easy way. First of all, and I think that's useful to remember, the words by Madam Esia Konva yesterday to remind us, and which we always need to do, that migration policy is about individual human beings, and there is a human story behind each migrant, each refugee, and that's the basis that we always have to remind ourselves when we try to construct the bigger migration policy. I was, of course, also struck by the words of Mr. Vitorino in his excellent introductory speech. He referred to Justice and Home Affairs as an island in 1999. While now, 20 years later, Justice and Home Affairs is part of something bigger, an EU framework accepted as an EU competence. That deserves to be noted. If I may add a modest reminiscence of myself, I think we spent actually quite some years after the Amsterdam Treaty in 1999 getting comments such as, but Justice and Home Affairs is not an EU competence, why are you doing all this? That did not stop in the year 2000, if I put it like that. That only stopped a number of years later. Today, I think that's over. Now it's accepted EU competence, and we are this conference is an example of how we go into the details, how we engage, and the massive amount of academic research that goes into this area. This is an achievement that deserves to be underlined. Third, I would pick up in particular also on what the words of the former Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen said. First of all, to note the main or the big global challenges that Europe has been facing since 1999 and which were not predictable at that time. With the very volatile neighborhood and the security challenges that has influenced also the migration situation in Europe and put our systems to the test. But Mr. Lipponen also stressed the need to focus on the good, not just the missing parts, when we look back at Tampere and what has been achieved or not achieved. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. A small reflection from my side, if I did my counting correctly, and I would challenge you a little bit to see if you have these numbers in your head. I think in 1999, the Schengen area without internal borders consisted of 9 member states. 1999. Even the illustrious member state of Finland was not a part of that area in 1999. Today we are at 26 states part of the Schengen area without internal borders. I think that's quite a remarkable achievement in only 20 years to have enlarged this new project, this new experience, and made use of EU competence in such a rapid way. We have heard several examples, I think, during the panels and other presentations that we have now an almost complete acquis covering the whole migration and asylum area, even an acquis that has developed in several generations, which is also an accomplishment over the last 20 years. And as a third example, perhaps the most relevant one, if we look back just 5 years, the main advances on the operational dimension. The work of our agencies today on the ground in helping people, in helping the member states, I think would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. The same goes for the levels of funding that we have at the disposal of this still new policy area, as well as the IT systems that I think Jean-Louis flagged also in the beginning, where there is more in the pipeline already agreed and about to be implemented. So the operational dimension, also a key example, I think, of main progress. Now, we tend, of course, when looking back, to focus on 2015 as the dividing year. I would, and you might perhaps call me a somewhat naive optimist, nevertheless insist on that you can also put that in a positive sense. So this newly established, newly enlarged Schengen area and this newly developed common policy survived 2015, a challenge which was not foreseen in 1999 and which I think nobody was prepared for. But it's still there. It has its strengths and weaknesses, and there's still a need for a lot of work, but we survived that crisis. So there was a resilience in the system. I think also we drew a number of important lessons from 2015, which of course I will not go so much into detail now, but I think once again we saw, and that's the most important lesson of them all, for this kind of crisis, the only way to deal with it is to do it together at EU level. Any member state trying to act alone and trying to deal with a crisis of that magnitude will not manage. It is always better to do it together, and 2015 reaffirmed that once again. It reaffirmed the importance of partnerships with third countries, where getting out of the crisis, the EU-Turkey statement was an instrumental part. And equally, it demonstrated, perhaps only as a first step, but nevertheless, that there is solidarity in the Union and relocation can work. Something which we are still demonstrating also this year, that it's something that can work in practice and be made to happen on the ground. Now, looking a little bit more forward, here also I would refer to, I would say, the excellent presentation by Minister Ohisalo yesterday on describing the comprehensive approach to migration and asylum, which I think will also be and remain a guiding point also for the future. That we need to have irregular migration under control, we need to ensure protection for those in need, live up to our values as they are stated in the Charter, but also ensure the return of those who do not have the right to stay and ensure that we have strict control of our external borders. We also need to further develop the legal pathways, legal migration, resettlement, and equally important, continue to work on the external dimension, building the partnerships with third countries, addressing the root causes, and fighting against the smuggling and the trafficking that brings irregular migration to Europe. I think the key element perhaps to remember in the comprehensive approach is that all the parts are linked, they are all interlinked, and it will not be possible to separate or to pick out one, let's say, favorite part of this and try to focus only on that one. Because that will fail not only in practice, because the implementation of all these parts are linked in terms of how they are actually implemented, but also politically, how we develop these policies will need to go together and we need to address all of these parts. Now, looking forward again, as Jean-Louis said, you are aware that President-elect has announced her intention for the new Commission to present a new pact on migration and asylum. It is her firm intention also to relaunch the debate on the Dublin reform. We do need a fresh start, a new impetus in how we take that reform forward. We need to continue to look for common ground, and we need to base ourselves as much as we can on the unity among the member states, among the institutions, among the stakeholders. Both to keep the European project going in that sense, in that spirit of consensus, but also with the view to the future implementation. Solutions based on unity are better implemented than those that are, let's say, forced through with majority voting. This is a fact that we know from experience. The first step, and that has also been a strong commitment of our new Commissioner-designate Johansson, will be to engage in a thorough dialogue and discussion and consultations with member states, with members of parliament, the political groups, but also all other stakeholders. And that will be a very important first step for her, to listen to all views and see how can we construct a new policy framework that includes all elements of this comprehensive approach in the right mix, and also identify exactly which legislative proposals from the Commission are needed, be it as new proposals, be it as relaunched proposals, or which proposals would stay on the table as already presented in the last mandate. So in that light, I think this conference has been an excellent and very timely contribution. Really, we take a lot of interesting things with us. And I hope that you will continue to engage with us in this consultation and dialogue, to continue to feed your ideas as we continue our reflections on how we preserve what we have built up, the Schengen area, the common policies, and we continue to develop it to fill in the missing pieces and deal with the unfinished business of the last 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for this insightful synthesis of what was said, at least the main messages as you took them with you during these 1.5 days, and also for having been as far as you could in forecasting what the next step of the Commission could be. It's now my honor and my pleasure to give the floor to Tanja Fajon. When referring to the European Parliament, common sense now is to say, okay, the European elections have had an impact, not as dramatic as we thought, but there is a changing landscape within the European Parliament. Clearly, the institution is determined to show its muscles. You shut down 3 designated commissioners, which is, I think, is a record. But on the other hand, we all have in mind the splitted vote that took place 2 days ago on the draft resolution on disembarkation and interception at seas. The question is, of course, how much is this, shaping the future agenda of the European Parliament? I mean, can you tell us more about how you see the institution moving on this area, which is so emotional, as it was said, and on which you are certainly going to come back again and again.
Thank you very much, and I think I can leave my papers aside because you raised very important questions. And as we have discussions this morning on Schengen, future of migration and the future of EU, where are we going on, some very important challenges that we have. But you started saying that the European Parliament is showing its muscles, that we managed to shut down the 3 commissioner designates. I wouldn't put it that bluntly. There was a reason for that. And we are still waiting. Now I understand we have 3 new nominees. There is another challenge that we don't have a gender balance anymore, but let's see how the new president of the Commission will tackle the issue. And there are still some difficulties. We have to have the hearings, and we did all our hearings, I would say, at least for my political group, Socialists and Democrats, in a very proper way. And we also demand still some changes in the portfolio and also with the titles that it comes. And as we are discussing migration, security and future of Schengen, I would like to point out that the title about European values, I find very controversial. Personally, I find it's a very rhetoric that goes as a gift to the extreme right. Because what are the European values and how to connect migration and security under this portfolio? I think this is something that we should not accept with the new Commission, and we also pass this message clear to the next president of the Commission. So this is one thing. Another is I am now 3rd time back in the European Parliament, and in the last mandate I was in charge for the Schengen reform, for a migration and asylum package, especially on criteria for the status, refugee status or subsidiary protection. And I was also still in charge for the Integrated Border Management Fund. Now, we had this morning an excellent discussion on the future of Schengen, and where we see the difficulties the next Commission will clearly face is, I'm afraid that we will see Schengen hostage of the Dublin reform. And this clear link has been made already with the new Commissioner designate. And clearly during the hearings and also in her written answers, We've seen that as long as we don't have safe external borders, we cannot drop the interior border controls. Now, here I see the difficulty, what was also said this morning, when we will see really safe external European borders. This is a very important question, because I think we are in the last few years building a lot on security measures. We are strengthening our external borders with technology. We are investing a lot. We did systematic border check controls that are in fact on the ground not really functioning the way we wanted to see. We are in this situation having 6 Schengen member states that are now prolonging interior border controls. I just give you an example, as I'm coming from Slovenia. Last year, Austria returned 39 people to Slovenia. So where is the argumentation for having for 4 years interior border controls? So we have Schengen at risk. It's clearly not functioning. This week, something else also happened. We got a positive evaluation on a border, on a Schengen for Croatia, and I'm afraid it's quite a bianco check. I like to see positive signal to send out to other member states that, yes, we welcome you in Schengen, but we know that for 10 years we are saying the same to Bulgaria and Romania, and nothing has happened. It's even worsened. It worsened also when we talk about migration, when we look at the situation. We as Socialists and Democrats, and I'm today representing, I have to say, the Libe Committee and our chair, Juan López Aguilar, who is apologizing. He's not here today, but we have been working a lot on migration files in the last few years, that we always try to defend comprehensive approach. That was reflected in our migration resolution, Mejola Kinge Metsola, you know it, how to tackle migration, how to make a holistic approach, tackle where there are sources of migration, how to make our borders safe, how to fight illegal migration. We adopted, in fact, in the last years, all necessary legislation that was on the table, including very ambitious Dublin reform. But it has been blocked in the member states for a while now, the same as Schengen. It has been blocked also. I would like to recall that also on Schengen, I was a rapporteur, we adopted an ambitious reform before the end of previous term. We reconfirmed the mandate now, but it's blocked in the member states. So we have quite some challenges ahead, and I asked also the future commission or those that are in charge for those files, first on Schengen. Is the Commission willing to take the member states, if we don't have a reform soon, to the European Court? As we see, it's illegal what is happening on our interior border controls. And the answer was clear, it's not a priority. We try to discuss in a dialogue, we'll try to find the solutions. But if there will be in the future a clear link also with migration and the Dublin reform, I'm seriously concerned, especially knowing that you mentioned we have a lot of emotions, and that I experienced myself during the election campaign, that we are living in a Europe, 1 minute left, that, sorry, thank you, that this is a very politicized topic. It's a very abused topic, discussing migration. And in this environment with a lot of emotions, with a very dangerous, I would say, populist nationalist rhetorics, that we are in a situation as politicians that we difficult find common sense and reasonable solutions. And we are difficult being in a position to be courageous. So these are the challenges we face, and we will continue. I see in the new European Parliament, we don't have clear majorities now. We are even more polarized. We will have most probably to find alliances from topic to topic. Yesterday we had this unfortunate vote, I can say very unfortunate, on the resolution on how to resolve or how to solve or how to save lives in Mediterranean, losing for 2 votes. But I would like to say a lot of people, unfortunately, were leaving the room because it was Thursday. And the other part of the parliament, or conservatives, were celebrating. They were celebrating the fact that we are willing to criminalize NGOs that try to help people. And I was yesterday actually very shocked to see that this institution turned that way. But I would like to assure that at least, I hope in Libe, we were normally more reasonable in adopting a human legislative, that we will also continue doing so. So this would be my message also to all of us. Tampere is still alive. I'm glad that we had this conference today and yesterday. I was not participating, but we should maybe sometimes remind us on where our roots have begun. Where is our strategic focus? It's the same when we discuss about the future of European Union. Throughout the crisis, we forgot what are our strategic goals in this integration process. And Schengen and our security and safety of our borders, but the freedoms inside, this is the biggest capital, this is the biggest investment. This is something most tangible people feel today. And for this is worth to fight. So this is my message at the end, and thank you to Finnish Presidency and all organizers to inviting us here.
Thank you. The time has now come to benefit from the comments of two observers. The first one, Dimitri Papademetriou, has been with us since the beginning. Dimitri, your voice and your wisdom have regularly crossed the Atlantic to provide us with the right nudges at the right moment. Everybody in this room now, how influential you could have been by expressing views, expressing opinions, being listened by the right person at the right moment. So needless to say that we would all listen very carefully to what your takes are from this conference.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, and I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and all of you, because I've learned more in the past day and a half than probably the last several years of my life on this. I thank the organizers for inviting an outsider insider to sort of share a few thoughts. And, you know, when someone is a closing, or I'm on the closing speakers, the task becomes both difficult and easy. The easy thing would be to just sort of add to the sort of enthusiasm for more of everything, you know, more Europe, better and more legislation, more protections, listening more to the NGOs, worrying about all the people who are indeed dying in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, etc., etc. And that's too easy. And I never try to do the thing that is easy, because we need to make progress, and progress is always messy. So what I will do is reflect on the event itself and try to see whether we can imagine together a future in which we make progress without forgetting that we need to bring along our publics. It's all right to be reinforcing each other, to be talking about more legislation, more rights, more this, more that. But if we cannot bring along our publics, we are not going to make lasting progress. So I'm going to say a few words about some favorite topics of mine, I guess. The fact that, I'll start with the fact that we need to dig down from rhetoric to action. Rhetoric is easy. We're all very good at it, extremely good at it. But action is always difficult, because it forces us to make difficult choices. And that's how we make progress, I think. Clearly, we can have incantations, as we have had in the past day and a half, about more solidarity, values, partnerships, common asylum and migration systems, etc. And the papers have done a great job in laying out what the opportunities are, what needs to be done, etc., etc. But it seems to me that what we need more of is judgment, strategy, and pragmatism above all. And I will spend a bit of time to demonstrate, the need for pragmatism. If we're going to make progress, as we need to, we do have to be extremely pragmatic. And I will demonstrate how pragmatism plays into some of the issues that we discussed in the last day and a half by demonstrating how many bridges we need to cross if we are to accomplish something that I think intuitively we all understand that we need to accomplish. Namely, to make EASO into an organization that can make decisions that we can all respect and implement. Well, this is a maddeningly complex task because it requires and it demonstrates how interconnected all of these institutions and their decisions are. And I think we must be realistic about the difficulty of all this interconnectedness. EASO will have to be staffed up to an enormous degree in order to do some of the things that we think that they should be doing. In a difficult funding environment, as it will be in the next 5 years, it will need to be funded at a much higher level. Member states will need to actually adjust their regulations, legislation, or whatever in order to be able to take advantage of this enhanced, more powerful, more independent, more thoughtful EASO. Its data systems, as we heard, will have to become interoperable. I don't know how well known or understood that term of interoperability is. In the United States, where we have a single government and have been in this business for a few hundred years, it has taken us about 15 years to actually make our data systems interoperable. We started in 2001. Now, most people will say we have a fairly interoperable data system. And also, in addition to that, have the people who make adjudication decisions what they need to do in order to make these decisions, which is all the information that's necessary about an individual, a set of circumstances back home, etc., etc. This is, in other words, data and information in real time. And we can just meet for Tampere 3.0 20 years from now, and we'll say, okay, if we've really done extremely well, we have an essentially interoperable data system. And of course, whether EASO can succeed or not will depend very much on whether other institutions within the Commission, within the Union, are also doing their job, and they are doing their job in a very synchronous way. For instance, EASO can make a decision about somebody who should receive asylum, but relocating those asylum seekers will require the cooperation of an awful lot of other organizations, institutions, and of course, of member states. And furthermore, if EASO is to make decisions of that nature, who is going to implement the returns that are necessary in order for you, for the EU, for any country, the United States, any country, to actually have a functioning immigration system? Because that's what we're talking about, systems and immigration systems in particular. So we must, it seems to me, force ourselves to temper our ambition with patience and pragmatism. And these are the kinds of things that I think all of us ought to be thinking about. But this is not the only thing that I wanted to say. I want to talk about a favorite topic of mine, trust. We have heard here the word trust a number of times, but typically in a narrow way, a trust between, an asylum seeker and the government, or an institutional kind of arrangement. But trust is a much, much bigger concept than that. The biggest casualty of the last 5 years everywhere, not just here in Europe, is the loss of trust. Trust among European institutions, trust among member states, trust between some member states and European institutions, between publics, the electors, and elected officials, across ministries and DGs, something that Jean-Louis and I and a number of other people have been trying to work very hard on for 20 years now, between publics and European institutions, between the EU and most or several member states and their partners. The use of language is extremely important. Do we really believe that we know what a partnership means? How do you have partnerships with sending of transit countries, under the conditions that we expect them to abide by and us to benefit from? So every time that, we think that somehow we have turned time is up, you're telling me. So let me say a couple more words, if I might, about I'm just going to have to just basically talk a little bit about two other things. Before 5 or 7 years ago, we had people who didn't agree with us. They were slowly organizing themselves, but we didn't have something that we have had in the past 5 or 6 years. And that something is now all around the world. We did not have organized political parties, populist, nativist populist, nationalist parties that are acting in a way that, in a sense, divides already divided and polarized countries and tears us apart. And this is not just a European phenomenon. In the United States and North America, we have two very populist presidents. You only think, of course, of one of them because he's, okay, I'm not going to say anything, the United States, but also Mexico. And I don't distinguish between populism of the right and populism of the left. They are both equally dangerous. And Brazil, and about 5 or 6 other Latin American countries, and much of Asia now is ruled by populists, whether it is Modi in India, whether it's Xi in China, Vietnam, and so many, the Philippines. Populism is here to stay. And it will check the power that we think that we can exert through the ballot box. So if we think that we can just go into business as usual, I think that's not realistic. We ought to rethink the whole thing. The final thing I'm going to say, the parting thought, is that in most worthwhile projects, by worthwhile I mean difficult projects, such as the European project, or trying to resolve the issues around, migration, asylum, etc., and borders, and all of these difficult issues, you require both poets and plumbers. And I'd like you to ask yourselves, I'm not going to, play the game of me suggesting this and that and the other thing. Do you know who the poets and who the plumbers are going to be in the years ahead in Europe? And can they work in tandem? Because only if they can work in tandem can we make tangible progress. Thank you very much for putting up with me.
Thank you very much. We have also with us as our fourth panelist, Madam Kiviniemi. I just want to stress how much the presence of Madam Kiviniemi as well as of Prime Minister Lipponen yesterday morning embodies the support that the Finnish presidency and Finland more in general have been given since the beginning to this endeavor, and the importance that Finland as a member state and as a member state holding the presidency is attaching to events like this one. We thank you very much for your presence, and we're going to listen very carefully to your assessment of what has been done during these 36 hours.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here today, and it's a bit difficult to be the last speaker in the final session. I don't think that there is not something which haven't been said during these 2 days, but in any case I want to deliver my remarks. I worked with these migration issues during my years at the OECD, as I think almost everyone did, because those were the very hectic years when the refugee flows arrived in Europe, and we of course from the OECD side in those days tried to also provide our support to the EU and member countries in order to handle with the issue and improve the system. But this seminar really is needed in order to discuss and analyze the challenges which the common European asylum system faces. And I think that many of you have already stated and said here that more needs to be done to make the CEAS more efficient, harmonized and stable. And it really has been a difficult journey. Public opinion surveys still find that the public, including migrants themselves, do not have full confidence in governments and EU's capacity to manage migration and ensure successful integration. Progress in migration management on both the national and international front remains abstract for many people who often feel overwhelmed with conflicting messages and impressions on refugees and migration. So it's therefore very important to rebuild trust in migration policies and institutions. And I think that is one of the reasons why we are here today. Fears about migration must be addressed by using a balanced and facts-based discourse. Leadership in this case means addressing the challenges that do exist, not echoing the fears of ill-informed prejudice. And it is really difficult to ensure that conversations around migrations are based upon facts and evidence. It's very difficult to fight against fake news and populism, but the only solution is really to try to provide as much information as needed, deliver it. And of course, media plays here a big role, but also the EU institutions and member countries could perform better. The common European asylum system is far from being perfect, but during the years also a lot has been achieved. The current state of the system, but also the failures and future steps could be communicated better. But there is also a certain need to go back to basics, because unfortunately a majority of the European public, for example, doesn't feel well informed about immigration and integration. Surveys still show that the public thinks there are far more migrants than there really are. And half of all Europeans think there are more undocumented migrants in their countries than those legally present. And the real figure is much lower. It is essential, of course, also to spell out the potential benefits of migration more clearly. For example, when some argue that recent years' large refugee flows will be very costly because immigrants displace native workers and come to EU countries for social benefits, but there is, as we know, solid evidence that this is not the case. The OECD's migration report from last year showed that in most cases, fears about the impact of refugees on jobs in EU countries are simply at odds with the facts. Indeed, the analysis suggests that the labour market impact of the recent refugee inflow will be small and concentrated. In Europe as a whole, the increased inflow of refugees in 2015-16 is projected to enlarge the labour force by no more than 0.4% by December 2020. But in some countries, however, the impact is expected to be much higher. Austria, Germany, Sweden will experience an increase of up to 0.8%. Since finding a job takes time, the impact on the host country labour force will initially materialise more in an increase in unemployment than in employment. And improving labour market integration is thus critical, since employment affects many other dimensions of refugee social integrations. Employers have a very important role to play in this respect, as well as better recognition of qualification is needed. But we also have to be very honest when informing the public. There are both winners and losers associated with migration, and migration can be beneficial overall, but some groups, such as the unskilled, may be faced with increased competition in the labour market if many unskilled migrants enter a country. And this report, to which I referred already, showed that in Austria and Germany, the segment of young, low-educated men could swell by 15%, and that is a rather large increase. But really, integration is the key, and although many countries have made progress in this respect, many challenges remain. The integration of refugees is most difficult, largely because many of them are low-skilled, and it takes about 20 years for refugees in Europe to achieve employment rates similar to those of other migrant groups. And we all know that this is far too long. Early integration, tailored measures, and access to services have to be guaranteed. And I also want to underline the fact that integration is a joint effort, because failed national integration have knock-on effects in other countries. It's all too easy and too common to turn on the television and see a magnified, sometimes sensationalized version of poor integration. And this fuels fears, shifts the migration discourse, and undermines balanced debate on the relevant issues. And EU support joint action with member countries as well as global cooperation is needed when it comes to integration. Ladies and gentlemen, reliable, fact-based information on many aspects of migration, refugees, or integration is not only needed to counter fake news and make public understand better that the outcomes of the refugee flows and migration in general, but to help us all understand how to perform better. Knowing how many, who, where from, and where is obviously not sufficient to make migration a powerful engine of our economies and a positive element of our societies. And we need to know more about the what and the how. Evaluating and analysing the current system of CEAS and integration of refugees in member countries is utmost important in order to find out what works and what doesn't. And that's why, for example, CISOVAL project is utmost important. Also, more surveys and evidence is needed, especially in those areas where it's lacking. For example, despite the relevance for migration and integration policy, empirical evidence on integration effects from family migration is largely absent. Quantitative approaches that cover several countries appear to be missing altogether, and the paucity of evidence therefore contrasts with the prominence of recent debates on family reunification. The situation doesn't make it easier for the European countries to deal with large numbers of requests for family reunification made by recently arrived refugees. But also in this respect, the migration outlook of the OECD, which was published a month ago, brings some new evidence on what works and what doesn't. The survey showed that delays in family reunification may actually have adverse consequences for migrant integration in the long term. And for example, spouses whose arrival is delayed have lower language skills than those who were able to reunify quickly. And delay is also associated with a lower employment probability, and there are also negative effects on children. Children who arrive later are less likely to finish the tertiary education. So the survey also finds a positive effect on migrants' parental employment when their parents, that is, the grandparents' generation, are in-house. So these findings are, as well as other studies, should be looked at very thoroughly by the EU policymakers as well as member states. It's important to base the decisions on facts and best practices, also in those cases where evidence very clearly shows that policies should be heavily reformed in a way which does, at least in the short run, face a lot of resistance from the public. So, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope that the new Commission and European leaders will take bold decisions to make the common European asylum system more efficient, harmonized and stable, so that Europe as a whole emerges stronger economically, socially and politically. Thank you.
Well, okay, I don't know if I'm going to speak from the podium because I was not formally a panelist, but let me simply share with you a few thoughts at the end of this last concluding session. When we were preparing this conference, together with the organizers, we had a fear, and that is to say that the debate would be completely hijacked by what has happened since 2015-2016. Although the very reason why we took the time to organize this was to look back to the development over 20 years of a common migration policy or common approach of migration, and of course not only looking back for the sake of looking back, but also drawing some lessons for the future. At the end of this session, I can say on behalf of the organizers that we are reassured about this. That thanks to the quality of the background document, thanks to the quality of your contribution, and as reflected by the individual reports that you've heard during the previous session, we exactly stick to that line. Yes, indeed, the 2015-2016 crisis was an accelerator, not necessarily in the right direction, by the way, but we were able to assess what has happened in the framework of what was there beforehand and what has been built since Tampere. Now, the next question is, of course, how relevant is it still today to refer to Tampere? I could not but quote Prime Minister Lipponen yesterday morning. When Tampere was drafted, we did not know that we would have 9/11, and we did not know that we would have had Syria, just to take an example. And that, of course, should Tampere had to be redrafted today, it would not be drafted the same way. That is absolutely self-evident. Now, I think that we should take the milestones for what they are, because, many of you, during your intervention and also in the paper, systematically referred to the relevance of these milestones since 20 years after. Here, I could not refrain to quote, you know that I've been involved in humanitarian aid for the last 6 years of my career in the Commission, a very prominent person in the area of humanitarian aid, i.e. Peter Bauer, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Humanitarian aid and humanitarian people, professionals, like to posture themselves as principled. Humanitarian aid is based on fundamental principles which are enshrined in the treaty and which are enshrined in the document called the European Consensus on Humanitarian Aid. And what Peter Maurer says about this principle is very relevant as far as the milestones of Tampere are concerned. He said the principles are like the horizon The more you walk towards the horizon, the further away it seems, but it is not a reason not to keep on walking towards the principle or towards this horizon. I think that we should approach our relation with the Tampere milestone that way. Now, many things were said during at least the sessions that I attended, and I cannot refrain but quote some of these statements, and sorry for the other ones, but I was not physically present for the other sessions. I felt that there was a hidden and sometimes vocally expressed expectation that now the time has come for the EU institution to divert its energy towards other priorities. I mean, the Green Deal, the digitalization of our societies, an equitable social transition, the new multi-annual financial framework, which is going to be the priority of next year, so that migration issues could be dealt with in a somewhat less emotional way. It resonates with one of the statements that was abundantly retweeted yesterday from Professor Gibril Fall, who said only one policy line: no policies and just but implementation. No new policies, but just but implementation. Fine, but however, Antonio Vitorino reminded us in his intervention that we would actually have no breathing space because there would be another crisis, and that the new crisis, the crisis to come, was around the corner. Many are also of the view that, after all, the ingredients of the 2015-2016 crisis are there, and that similarly to the situation within the Eurozone, because many parallelisms could be drawn between the migration crisis and the Eurozone crisis, we are still in a very weak position, and that the situation is, between inverted commas, definitely not under control. Moreover, as amply demonstrated by the debate about Schengen that you referred to, Madame Fayon, this morning, I was quite impressed by this session. Emotion has served as a breeding ground, and I will quote Ugo Brady, for anger, and that the position within the Council and between the more member states are more entrenched than ever for the time being. But one thing is for sure, and I would join Dimitri in what he said, is that public opinions will not forgive any failure to provide an appropriate answer to migration question, whatever it takes. Appropriate does not mean abiding to populist discourse and analysis. It means also going to the people with a new narrative, going to the people with facts and not figure and not perceptions. And I know that it was said by Giulio Di Berzio yesterday afternoon, migration handling is more about perception than figure, but that we have some time to bring the people back to figures, and that's also the responsibility of the political leader, and that's what political leadership means. I mean, bringing people perception closer to the reality. On the top of that, we should by no means underestimate the totally perverse consequences of what is happening inside the EU today to our relation with our so-called partners. Dimitri will know what I'm referring to. I will quote someone attending the Transatlantic Dialogue on Migration that he chaired and he convened 2 weeks ago. I have sometimes the feeling that our partnership with third countries is more about managing mistrust. And the best way to manage mistrust for us would be to get our house in order and to behave. I would then quote Ima Vasquez in her intervention yesterday concerning the relation with third countries. The level of violence against migrants has reached, is speaking everywhere, and it's absolutely intolerable, and it was again reflected by the presentation of UNDP yesterday. Limiting the violence the migrants are victim of does not mean changing policies. A sovereign state can say to anybody, any third country nationals, I'm sorry, dear sir, dear madam, I don't want you to stay 1 minute more on my territory because you are not allowed to stay on my territory. But you can say that and possibly implement that without depriving that person of food, without putting his children in a detention center, or his or her children, or without depriving him or her of basic health care. It's about, behaving, and by doing so, showing by example and rebuilding trust with our partners, which will be willing to actually engage with us. Where does that lead us to? I must say, I had a dream. And I will build that on this famous migration pact, which raises many questions. And I will also build on what you said, Hugo, this morning about the way the European Council is functioning. And you said very rightly, we have now a new generation of leaders. They don't know each other and they don't know this issue. Now, having had the privilege, its age, of being physically present 20 years ago in Tampere, what was for me one of the hidden lessons of Tampere? There were relatively little controversy about the text of the milestones themselves. I remember that we did not manage to convince President Chirac that we should keep the single European asylum system reference. It moved to common European asylum system, so be it. But for the rest, they were not heated discussion. But what matters is that these big guys spent 1 day and a half in a remote but nice Finnish city that some of you will visit this afternoon, discussing justice and home affairs, things that have been for them until now completely alien. So should not we think about something of that kind? Blair tried also in its day having this Ditchley Park meeting, where during next year's, and after all there is a succession of presidency next year, Croatia and Germany, which is a good one to achieve that. We would try, or some people together with the Commission, aiming having its new migration pact, of preparing this kind of informal deep dive into, okay, what do we actually want to achieve with regard to migration? Because pretending that we have a common migration policy means that we also agree on common objectives. These objectives might be the same as the ones in Tampere. They might differ, but okay, let's at least do that, and by preparing that event, let us try to rebuild this trust, which is obviously very absent between member states. Because there is one thing is for sure, and you will allow me to end up with a sentence in French: la confiance, ça ne se décrète pas, ça se construit. And by doing so, maybe we'll prepare the future of Europe for the younger member of the audience who is there, who has been very quiet, and who will be still proud to be European 20 years from now. Thank you very much.